The last thing Clint Denton ever gave his daughter was a ring too big for her finger and a warning she did not understand until it was almost too late. Ruby Mae Denton found the ring on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 years after the funeral, when she finally worked up the courage to go through her father's things. The box had been sitting in the corner of her apartment bedroom under a pile of her own winter coats, untouched, sealed with a strip of packing tape that had yellowed at the edges. She had moved it from the garage storage unit 6 months earlier when she had lost the lease. She had told herself she would open it when she was ready. She was never going to be ready. The ring was silver and heavy with a skull cast on the face and a small compartment underneath the jaw that clicked open when you pressed the left eye socket with your thumbnail. She had seen that ring on his hand her entire life, seen it on the kitchen table when he was working on something with both hands, seen it catch the light when he reached across to refill her coffee cup, seen it placed on the casket lid at the viewing slipped off his finger because the funeral home said they could not bury it with him on account of the metal content. She had always assumed it was biker jewelry, decoration, the kind of thing that men like her father wore to communicate something to people who already knew the language. Inside the compartment was a strip of paper no wider than a fortune cookie slip, 7 digits and a name. Iron. Call if I am gone and something is wrong. Ruby sat on the edge of her bed for a long time with that strip of paper in her hand. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for 2 years. She just had not known exactly what shape the wrong thing was until 3 days ago. She was 22 years old. She worked the morning shift at Dusty's Diner on Commerce Street in Clarksville, Tennessee, 6 days a week, 7 to 3:38 hours if she picked up a Sunday. She drove a 2008 Ford Ranger with a cracked windshield she kept meaning to get fixed. She had $412 in her checking account, a studio apartment above a dry cleaning shop that smelled faintly of chemicals, even with the windows open, and a pair of worn-down work boots she had been resoling herself since she could not afford a cobbler. The apartment was small enough that she had learned to keep it organized the way her father had kept the garage organized, everything with a place and returned to its place. Not because she was naturally tidy, but because in a small space disorder compounds, and she had enough disorder in her head already. The kitchen window looked out over an alley. She kept a coffee maker on the counter and ran it every morning at 6:15 and drank the first cup standing at that window, watching the alley get light. She had done this every morning for 2 years, and she had come to understand that the ritual was less about the coffee and more about the 5 minutes it created. 5 minutes in which she was simply a person standing at a window watching the world get light before she had to go be anything else. Before she had to be the girl whose father had died. Before she had to be the woman managing on $800 a month. Before she had to be anything except someone who was still here and still standing and still watching the alley go from gray to pale gold. It was a quiet life. She had constructed it to be quiet, which was different from it being quiet naturally. Natural quiet is what exists when nothing is happening. Constructed quiet is what you build around yourself when too much has happened, and you need the space to process it without the processing crushing you. She had been processing her father's death for 2 years and had not finished, and did not expect to finish, because grief of that particular kind, the grief for a parent who was also a whole world, does not resolve like a problem. It changes shape. You learn to carry it differently. The weight does not decrease. You become stronger, and the weight stays constant, and the ratio shifts. And one day, you notice you can walk a full day without stopping to sit down under it, and that is progress, even if it does not feel like it. The $800 monthly stipend from Dale covered her rent and not much else. She had thought sometimes about pushing back on the trust arrangement, about going to a lawyer and asking whether its terms were standard, whether a 22-year-old ought to be receiving $100 a week from a business her father had built and that her father had clearly intended to be hers. But pushing back required energy she was using for other things, and it required engaging with Dale in a way that felt every time she considered it like putting her hand into something she could not see the bottom of. She had told herself it was temporary. 3 more years, and the trust dissolved, and the garage was hers, and she could run it properly and stop collecting a stipend like a ward instead of an owner. 3 more years had felt like forever. Now, sitting with her father's ring in her hand and his messages on a dead phone, she understood that the 3 years had been the point. 3 years to cement Dale's control, while the garage was used for whatever it was being used for, with Ruby kept at a careful distance by the combination of grief and financial dependency and the appearance of paternal concern. He had been patient. She had to grant him that much. She had also, though she would not have used this word, been waiting for resolution, for understanding. The county sheriff's report had said single vehicle accident, and she had not believed it, not completely, not from the beginning, because she knew her father and she knew how he rode. Clint Denton had been riding motorcycles for 30 years without an accident. He checked his bike before every ride the way other men said grace, with precise and unhurried attention. She had watched him do it 10,000 times. She had learned from watching. The ritual of the pre-ride check, the order of it, the specific sequence of tire pressure and brake fluid and chain tension and lights was as familiar to her as the sound of his voice. She had done it herself on every bike she had ever ridden, because he had taught her that the check was not a burden, but a conversation with the machine, a way of understanding what you were about to trust your life to. She had gone to the accident site 2 days after the funeral. She had driven out to Highway 48 and parked her truck on the shoulder and walked the stretch of road where the report said the crash had occurred. She had crouched by the roadside and looked at the marks and the disturbed gravel and the broken glass already swept to the edge by passing traffic. She had looked at all of it and felt nothing that resembled accident. She felt intention in the clean arc of the skid marks. She felt purpose in the geometry of what had happened. She had no evidence. She had only the feeling, and the feeling was consistent and specific and would not resolve into anything she could act on. The county had closed the case in 30 days. Single vehicle accident, Highway 48, no foul play suspected. The paperwork had arrived at her apartment, and she had put it in the box with the rest of the things she was not ready to face, and she had gone back to work. She had not believed the accident story. She had also not had anything else to believe. No evidence, no contrary account, nothing except the wrongness she felt in her chest when she tried to accept it. So she had filed the wrongness away beside the box she was not opening and gone to work and come home and gone to work again, and 2 years had passed. She had no mother, no siblings, no family except the ghost of her father and the memory of what it had felt like to belong somewhere. Her mother had left when Ruby was 4. She had no memory of her as a person, only as an absence that her father had filled so thoroughly that for most of her childhood she had not noticed the shape of the gap. It was only in the years after his own death, when she sat alone in her apartment and tried to trace the outline of who she was, that she understood how much of herself had been shaped not by 2 parents, but by one, and how remarkable that was, and how the absence of one thing can sometimes make the presence of another more complete than it might otherwise have been. Her father had never spoken badly of her mother, had never used the leaving as an explanation or an excuse or a wound to pick at. He had simply been more filled, more space, been more present and more complete, and more thoroughly her parent than any single person had a right to be, as if he had made a private calculation about what she would need, and had committed to providing it without complaint or self-congratulation. She had not understood what that cost him until she was old enough to understand that everything costs something. Clint Denton had been the president of the Hells Angels Tennessee chapter for 11 years before the accident. He had raised Ruby alone, and he had done it well in the way of a man who understood that raising a daughter was the most important project of his life, and gave it the same attention he gave everything that mattered to him, which was total and methodical and uncompromising. He had braided her hair in the mornings with hands that could rebuild a carburetor from scratch. He had taught her to ride at 11, to change her own oil at 13, to read a person's intentions from the way they held their shoulders at 15. He had taught her that there was no substitute for doing a thing yourself, for understanding it from the inside, for knowing it with your hands as well as your head. That knowledge was the kind that could not be taken from you, and the kind that would serve you when every other resource was gone. He had never let her join the club, never let her near the dangerous parts of his world. But he had given her the tools to survive that world anyway, because he was a man who understood that you cannot always protect someone by keeping them at a distance. Sometimes the best protection is knowledge. The garage had been the center of everything. Not just the business, though. It was a good business, the kind of small operation that survives on reputation rather than advertising, where people brought their bikes from 3 counties away because they knew the work would be done right, and the price would be fair, and the person doing the work would not look at them like they were a problem to be solved, but like a person bringing something they cared about to someone who understood why it mattered. Denton's custom cycles on Commerce Street was also where Clint thought, where he solved problems, where he entertained, and where he retreated. Ruby had grown up doing homework at the workbench in the back while her father moved around the floor, his hands occupied and his mind apparently elsewhere, until he would surface to ask her something specific about a problem she was working through, and she would realize he had been listening the whole time. She had her own stool at that bench. Her initials were carved into the underside of it, RMD, made when she was 9 years old, with a pocket knife he had given her that she was not supposed to have at 9 years old, but that he had given her anyway because he had his own ideas about what children needed to know. She assumed he had found out about the carving eventually and chosen not to mention it. That was how they handled most things between them, aware of each other's choices, respectful of the reasoning behind them, even when it was not articulated. She missed the garage the way she missed her father, which is to say, constantly and specifically. She missed the smell of oil and metal and the sound of a torque wrench and the way the light came through the high windows in the afternoon. She missed having a place that was hers in a way that her apartment, however organized, was not. She missed the particular quality of being known that came from working in a space someone had shaped around you, where every tool was hung at the height that fit your hands, and every procedure had been developed with the assumption that you were watching and would eventually take it over. After Clint died, Dale Harker had managed everything. The insurance claim, the probate, the garage itself, which Clint had left in trust with Dale as executor until Ruby turned 25. 3 more years of Dale's control. He collected the income from the shop and paid Ruby her monthly stipend and called it her inheritance allowance. Said Clint had wanted the trust structured that way to protect her. He had made it sound like a gift, like careful foresight, like a dead man's generosity made manifest through the administration of his oldest friend. She had believed him because she had been 20 years old and her father was dead, and she had needed to believe someone. Dale had been her father's road captain, his second in command, his closest friend for 20 years. He had sat at their kitchen table for Thanksgiving, 3 years running. He had stood at the funeral and spoken on behalf of the brotherhood and told Ruby he would take care of everything with the steady authority of a man who had done this before. He had known all the right things to say in all the right moments. He had known them too well, she understood now. He had known the words of someone handling grief because he had been rehearsing them, not because he was feeling them. She had believed him because disbelief required energy, and she had none. She had believed him because the alternative, the belief that the man managing her father's estate was the man who had arranged her father's death, was a thing so large and so dark that approaching it felt like approaching a hole in the floor in the dark. You do not approach holes in the floor in the dark. You wait for light. She had waited 2 years. The light had come from inside a box she had been afraid to open. 3 days ago that had changed. It was a Saturday, her day off. She had gone to the garage because her Ranger was making a sound in the front left wheel, bearing that she wanted to diagnose herself. She had her own key to the side entrance. Always had. Clint had given it to her at 16 and told her this place was as much hers as it was his. That key was one of the things she had kept close all through the 2 years since his death, the way you keep something small and specific from a person you loved, not because the object is valuable, but because it is evidence. Evidence that the belonging was real. Evidence that the place had been hers once and would be hers again. She had parked in the back lot and let herself in through the side door at 9:47 in the morning. The garage was empty. Dale did not come in until noon on Saturdays. Bobby Nash, the young mechanic who worked the floor, usually arrived by 10, but was not yet there. The overhead lights were off, and the only illumination came through the high windows along the east wall. Pale March sunlight falling across the concrete in long rectangles, exactly the way it had always fallen. The same light she had done homework in for years. Ruby had walked toward the lift where her Ranger sat overnight and stopped. There was a smell that did not belong, something beneath the usual oil and metal and rubber. She stood still for a moment, listening. The building was quiet. And then she heard it. A sound from below, from the basement storage area where Clint had kept old parts and seasonal inventory. A sound she had first tried to explain away as pipes, as the building settling, as any of the reasonable explanations you reach for before your mind accepts the unreasonable one. A sound that was unmistakably human. The basement door was padlocked. New lock. Heavy duty. The old combination lock Clint had used for years had been replaced with a keyed deadbolt that Ruby had never seen before. She had stood in front of that door for 60 seconds, hand flat against the wood, listening. Footsteps. Soft. Shuffling. Then silence again, deliberate, like someone who had been trained to stay quiet, had accidentally made noise, and was now holding their breath, waiting to find out what happened next. Ruby had left the building without making a sound. She had walked back to her truck, driven 2 blocks, and sat in the parking lot of a CVS pharmacy for 20 minutes, trying to think clearly. Then she had driven back to her apartment and gone through her father's box for the first time since the funeral. She found the ring. She found the paper inside it. And she found something else at the bottom of the box, under a folded flannel shirt that still carried the faint ghost of his deodorant and motor oil, a burner phone dead, with a charging cable wrapped around it. It took her 40 minutes to find a compatible charger at the CVS, and another 20 minutes of sitting in her truck with the engine running before the phone came to life. There were 43 text messages in the outbox, all sent to a number with no name attached. The most recent, sent the night her father died, read, "They found out. Ruby must never know. Burn this. Get her out of Clarksville if you can." The message before that, sent 3 days earlier, "Dale is moving product through the shop. I have documentation. Working on getting it out safely. Do not contact me until I reach out first." And before that, 1 month earlier, "This goes higher than we thought. Not just Dale. Need more time." Ruby had read those messages 7 times in that parking lot. Then she had gone home and sat in the dark for a very long time, and the shape of the wrong thing had finally become clear. Her father had not died in a single vehicle accident. Her father had been killed because he knew something. And now she was living in a city where the man who had probably arranged his death controlled the only inheritance she had, and somewhere beneath the floor of the shop her father had built, there was a person who needed help. She spent 2 days trying to figure out what to do. She thought about calling the police. She thought about the FBI. She thought about getting in her truck and driving until she ran out of road and never coming back. And she thought about the ring, about the paper inside it, about a name her father had trusted enough to write down and hide for her to find. Iron. Call if I am gone and something is wrong. Something was wrong. Monday morning. 7 a.m. Ruby put on her work uniform, pocketed the strip of paper and the ring, and went to Dusty's diner because the rhythm of pouring coffee and calling orders was the only thing that had kept her sane for 2 years, and she needed to think clearly. Dusty's was a narrow place, 12 tables, and a counter with 8 stools, red vinyl seats repaired so many times with electrical tape that the tape had become as much of the decor as anything else. Terry, the owner, was 71 years old and came in every morning at 5 to start the biscuits herself because she did not trust anyone else to do it right. She had hired Ruby the week after Clint's funeral because she had known Clint for 30 years, and she had looked at Ruby standing in the doorway in her dead father's flannel shirt and said, "You start Thursday. Do not be late." Ruby was never late, not once in 2 years. She worked the counter and 2 tables near the window, kept her orders straight without writing them down, remembered regulars' preferences without being told twice. She was good at her job in the way that people who are surviving rather than living are good at jobs requiring focus and physical motion. It kept her present. It kept her from disappearing into her own head. But this Monday, she could not stay present. Dale Harker came in at 8:15. He did this sometimes, sat at the end of the counter with black coffee and a newspaper, and spoke to her in the comfortable proprietary way of a man who believed he was doing her a favor by existing in her vicinity. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a rough way when he was younger and was now just rough. He wore his colors even off the bike, but on him, the vest did not look the same as it had on her father. On Clint, it had looked like belonging. On Dale, it looked like a claim. "Morning, Ruby May," he said. He always used both names, like she was a child, like she was something he had named. She poured his coffee without being asked, did not look at him. "You look tired." His voice was conversational, casual. "Long weekend," she said. "You should rest more. You work too hard." He opened his newspaper. "Your father always said you pushed yourself too much." She had a moment standing at the counter with the coffee pot in her hand where she thought, "You knew my father. You sat with my father for 20 years. You stood at his funeral and told me everything would be okay." And then she put that thought somewhere, she could reach it later, and smiled the smile she had been using on difficult customers for 2 years, the smile that showed her teeth and showed nothing else. He left at 9. She watched his truck pull out of the lot. At 10 after 11, Bobby Nash came in for his lunch break. This was also routine. He ordered the same thing every time: burger, no onions, sweet tea, and a piece of Terry's lemon chess pie, if there was any left. He was 28, lean, with short sandy hair, and the kind of quiet that was not shyness, but deliberateness, like he was always measuring how much of himself to show. Ruby had liked him from the beginning, without quite being able to say why. He had worked at the garage for 8 months, brought in by Dale with references from a shop in Nashville. She set down his sweet tea and leaned on the counter. "Bobby," she said quietly, "has Dale changed anything in the basement storage lately?" He stilled. Just for a half second, just long enough for her to notice before his face went neutral again. "Why do you ask? New lock on the door. I went by Saturday. Did not recognize it." Bobby picked up his tea, took a slow sip, set it back down. Dale reorganized the back storage a few weeks ago, said he needed better security for some vintage parts inventory. What kind of vintage parts need a deadbolt instead of a combination lock? He did not answer right away. "Bobby." She kept her voice low. "I heard something down there. Saturday morning when no one else was in the building." The look that moved across his face in that moment was not the look of a man hearing unexpected information. It was the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been told someone else could see the weight of it. "Ruby," he said very quietly, do not what? Do not pull that thread. Not yet. Not on your own. Is there someone in that basement?" He did not answer. "Bobby." Is there a person being held in that basement? He looked up at her. The thing she saw in his eyes was not guilt and not fear alone, but something more complicated, something that looked like anguish and calculation happening simultaneously, like a man who was trying to solve two equations at once and could see they had different solutions. Go to work, he said. Let me handle this, and tonight do not go to the garage alone. That is not an answer. It is the only one I can give you right now. He pushed a $20 bill across the counter. Please, Ruby, trust me for 72 hours. She thought about that, thought about the paper in her pocket with a name on it, thought about her father's last message burning in her mind. She picked up the 20. 72 hours, she said. She lasted 19. Tuesday morning at 4 a.m., she parked her Ranger 2 streets away from the garage and walked in through the alley behind the building, the way she had done 100 times as a teenager, bringing her father dinner when he worked late. She wore dark clothes and flat shoes, and she carried the ring in her left hand, the skull face pressing into her palm. She knew the building, knew every entry point, every squeaky board, every shadow. She let herself in through the side door and stood in the dark listening. The garage was not empty. Dale Harker was there. On the phone in the back office door, a jar voice low but audible in the silence. Ruby stood without breathing. Pickup is Thursday. Yeah. Both of them. Same transport as before. Memphis. Handoff. The buyer is confirmed. His voice was patient, businesslike, the voice of a man discussing logistics. Both of them. She had thought there was one person in that basement. She moved through the garage without turning on lights, keeping close to the wall, placing each foot with the careful deliberateness her father had trained into her. She reached the basement door. The padlock was engaged. She looked at the tool wall to her right and found a thin pry bar, the kind used for removing trim panels. She fitted it behind the hasp where the screws were anchored into the door frame. Old wood, old installation. She had seen her father reinforce this frame twice and knew it had not been redone since. 4 careful applications of leverage pressure spread across 30 seconds, and the hasp pulled free from the frame with a sound like a muffled crack that she covered by letting a wrench clang off the tool wall simultaneously. She pulled the door open. Stairs going down. Darkness below. And the smell again, stronger now, unmistakable. She used her phone screen at minimum brightness and went down. The basement was divided by old metal shelving units loaded with boxed parts. She moved toward the back corner where the building's original crawl space had been converted into a utility room decades ago, back when her grandfather had owned this building before her father. The utility room door had a sliding bolt on the outside. Simple, cheap. The kind of lock you used when you did not need security from outside because the threat was from within. Ruby slid the bolt, opened the door. 2 people sat against the back wall, both young women, both in the condition of people who had not been treated with care. The first was pale and slight, probably 19 or 20, with dark circles under her eyes and rope burn visible at her wrists. The second was older by a few years, with a defiance set to her jaw, even in the dimness that told Ruby she had not stopped fighting, regardless of how long she had been here. Both flinched hard when the door opened, then froze, staring at Ruby's silhouette. "I am not with them," Ruby whispered. "My name is Ruby Denton. My father used to own this building. I am going to get you out." Silence. Then the younger one whispered, "There is a man upstairs." "I know. He is in the office. How many others?" "Just him tonight. Usually 2, but the other one left around midnight. Can you walk?" The younger one nodded. The older one was already pushing herself to her feet. "My name is Jessie," the younger one said. "Jessie Calloway. I have been here for 6 weeks." The name hit Ruby like something physical. 6 weeks ago at the coffee shop on Franklin Street, someone had posted a missing persons flyer on the community board. Jessie Calloway, 19, from Nashville, last seen leaving her apartment. Ruby had noticed it because Jessie had a wide smile and looked like someone's daughter, like someone who should have been home by now. "Okay," Ruby said. "Jessie, come with me. Both of you stay close. Stay quiet." They had made it to the foot of the stairs when the light came on, not the overhead lights. Dale's phone flashlight aimed directly at them from the top of the stairs, blinding all three of them. Well, Dale's voice was not the voice of a surprised man. It was the voice of a man who had been expecting this. "You always did have too much of your father in you, Ruby May." She put herself between him and the two women behind her. 10 feet to the stairs, Dale at the top, no clear exit. Dale reached up and bolted the basement door from the top. The sound of that bolt sliding home was the sound of a trap closing. "I gave you every opportunity to stay out of this." He came down the stairs slowly, phone still aimed at her. "Your daddy did not stay out of it either. Same problem, both of you. Cannot leave well enough alone." Ruby's hand was tight around the ring. 15 years of knowing this man, 15 years of his hand on her shoulder at church, and his voice telling her everything would be okay. What did you do to him? It was not a question. She already knew. "He made it complicated," Dale said simply. "Same as you are making it complicated right now." He had a phone in his right hand and a taser in his left. "I am not going to hurt you, Ruby. This is business. You will be transferred with the other two, and the buyer understands that you are the daughter of Clint Denton, which means there is significant interest." He paused. "You are worth more than the others. Your father would have hated knowing that." Something moved in her chest that was not fear. Something that felt like the opposite of fear, like all the grief she had been carrying for 2 years catching fire. "My father died because of you." He considered this, then nodded once the way a man nods when acknowledging something that is not quite a confession, but is not a denial either. "He was going to dismantle everything I built," Dale said. 20 years of work. He thought loyalty to a patch meant loyalty to some idea of who we were. He did not understand that things change, that there is money in this world that makes a motorcycle club look like a children's hobby. He paused. "He was my best friend. I want you to know I took no pleasure in it." Ruby looked at the bolt above the stairs, at Dale, at the two women behind her, at the phone in her hand, and she said, "I need to use the bathroom." Dale blinked. Her voice had been perfectly steady. Practical, the voice of someone asking for a completely normal thing in a completely abnormal situation. "The utility room has a drain. Use that." She looked at him steadily. "There are 2 other women in here. We have been here for hours. Some basic dignity, Dale." He studied her for a moment. Then he nodded toward the far corner. "There is a bathroom rough in behind the last shelving unit. I will wait here." She walked toward the back of the basement, counted his footsteps behind her, counted the shelving units between them. She was not going to the bathroom. Her father's original 1979 Harley-Davidson Sportster sat under a tarp in the back corner of the basement, exactly where it had been since before she was born. Clint had put it there 20 years ago and called it retirement savings. He had never gotten back to it. Ruby pulled the tarp off in one smooth motion and crouched beside the gas tank. Her father's last message had said he was working on getting documentation out safely. She looked at the tank, ran her fingers along the underside. There. Something had been resealed with fresh sealant along the lower seam. Recent work. She could see the color difference between old oxidized metal and new compound. She did not have tools to open it here, did not have time, but she had the ring. She worked the skull's left eye socket open, the hidden compartment, pulled out the strip of paper with the number. 7 digits. Iron. She typed the number into her phone, added the area code she guessed from the Arkansas exchange her father had used on the burner, and she typed one message. "My name is Ruby May Denton, Clint's daughter. I need help. I am locked in the basement of Denton's Custom Cycles, 1847 Commerce Street, Clarksville, Tennessee. There are 3 of us. Dale Harker has us. He killed my father. Thursday is the deadline. She sent it. Then she tucked the phone into her boot, stood up, straightened her shoulders, and walked back toward Dale like someone who had done nothing more than use a bathroom. Ruby Mae Denton was 22 years old. She had no mother, no father, no allies she could name with certainty. She had a ring, a dead man's number in her phone, and a piece of evidence sealed inside an old motorcycle that might prove everything or might prove nothing. She had her father's blood in her veins and his training in her hands, and 2 women behind her who needed someone to stand in front of them. She stood at the foot of those stairs and looked at Dale Harker in the eye, and she waited for someone to hear her. At 4:17 a.m. a phone buzzed on a nightstand in a house outside Fort Smith, Arkansas. Iron Kane reached for it with the automatic reflex of a man who had spent 30 years training himself to respond to nighttime communications without fully waking up, because in his world, nighttime communications were never social. He read the message once. Then he sat up and read it again in the light of the screen. Clint Denton had been dead for 2 years. Iron had stood at the man's funeral, had placed his hand on the casket, had looked at the 20-year-old girl with her father's green eyes standing at the graveside in borrowed black, and thought, there is nothing I can do for her right now that will not make it worse. He had left his number with the funeral home and asked them to pass it to Ruby if she ever reached out, had heard nothing, had told himself she was okay. The instinct that said something was wrong with Clint's death had never fully gone away, but he had told himself it was just grief looking for somewhere to put itself. He had waited when he should have acted, and the daughter of a dead friend had figured out what acting looked like before he had. He was calling Raymond Hawk Torres before his feet hit the floor. Hawk picked up on the second ring, not groggy, already awake, which meant either he had never slept or he had gotten the kind of news that made sleep irrelevant. I know, Hawk said when Iron started talking. I have been monitoring Denton's cycles for 6 months. Iron stopped, stood in the dark of his bedroom processing that. Hawk's voice was measured, careful, the voice of a man who chose his words precisely because he understood their weight. I left the department because I was tired of corruption eating cases. After Clint died, I started digging on my own time, reached out to an FBI contact. She put me in touch with someone already inside Denton's cycles. Inside the operation, Dale Harker is running out of it. Hawk paused. There is an undercover agent working the floor, has been for 8 months, building evidence on a trafficking network that runs from Tennessee to Memphis to 3 other states. He is close. But if Ruby is in that basement right now with 2 other women and Dale is preparing a Thursday transfer, we do not have 8 months left. We have hours. Iron was already pulling on clothes. What do you need from me? I need you to make calls. I am calling my FBI contact now. But Iron, he paused. The network Ruby's father stumbled onto does not stop with Dale Harker. Iron had been around long enough to know what that kind of pause meant. How high does it go? High enough that when I say the name to the FBI, they are going to need to tread very carefully because this person has political cover and law enforcement connections across 3 states. High enough that Clint Denton is dead because he got close to proving it. Tell me what I can do. Get me 100 brothers between Clarksville and Memphis by 6 a.m. Not to go in, to watch, to be visible, to make sure that if Dale Harker or anyone connected to him tries to move those women before the FBI gets into position, there is nowhere for them to go. Done. Iron was already scrolling contacts. And Hawk. When this is over, we are going to talk about why you have been running a parallel investigation without telling anyone. When this is over, you can be as angry as you want. Right now, I need you to make those calls. Iron made them. The first went to Marcus Tank Williams, former bouncer, 260 pounds of powerlifter's muscle, the gentlest man Iron had ever met, when it came to anything involving people who could not protect themselves. Tank answered on the first ring, said nothing except where and when, and I am already moving. The second went to Elena Doc Reeves, who did not ride, but who was the sharpest, trauma-trained mind in 3 chapters, and the one person Iron trusted absolutely to be the first face a frightened woman would see when the situation was resolved. Doc said she would bring her full medical kit and call St. Vincent's in Little Rock to have a trauma team on standby. The third went to Jacob Chains Murphy Road, captain 55 years old, 33 years riding the man who could coordinate 1,000 moving parts and make them look effortless. Chains asked 3 questions, got 3 answers, and had a positioning plan for 60 bikes laid out before the call ended. Iron dressed filled a thermos with coffee and walked out to his Harley in the dark. The night was cold and clear, the particular cold of early Tennessee spring that carries winter's memory even when the calendar has moved past it. He had driven this highway before in the dark. 20 years of it knew its bends and grades. He had driven it the morning of Clint's funeral coming up from Fort Smith in the gray hour before dawn, and he had driven it with the heaviness of a man going to bury someone he had known for 20 years. He drove it now with something different, not heaviness, the focused forward momentum of a man with a destination that mattered and hours to reach it. He thought about Clint as he rode, about the years of it, the particular texture of a friendship built not on proximity, but on the kind of intermittent deep contact that some friendships are made of, where you can go 6 months without speaking and then spend a week together, and it picks up exactly where it left off, because the foundation does not require maintenance, only respect. He thought about the last call between them 2 weeks before the accident, about nothing important, just checking in the way they checked in, and how he had not heard anything wrong in Clint's voice, even though Clint must have been carrying the full weight of what he knew. That was the kind of man Clint had been. He kept his burdens off other people's shoulders. He carried his own weight completely and quietly, and he had died for it, and the person who had figured out what had happened and done something about it was a 22-year-old girl who had been going to work at a diner 6 days a week for 2 years while holding the weight of everything she did not yet know. She had more of her father in her than Clint had probably understood. She had done exactly what he would have done, which was find the thread and pull it and send for help at the right moment. He had pulled the thread and forgotten to send for help at the right moment. She had learned from his mistake without knowing it was a mistake she was learning from. He drove it now with something different, not heaviness, the focused forward momentum of a man with a destination that mattered and hours to reach it. The ride from Fort Smith to Clarksville was 4 hours. He did not take it slow. In the basement of Denton's Custom Cycles, the hours moved the way hours move when you are waiting for something you cannot control. Dale had zip-tied Ruby's wrists with a precision that suggested practice. He sat at the foot of the stairs with his phone making calls, managing his logistics with the business-like patience of a man who had done this many times before. Ruby sat against the wall with Jessie Calloway on her left and Amber Wells on her right. Amber was 23 and from Bowling Green, Kentucky, and had been here for 11 weeks. She sat with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and watched Dale with the eyes of someone who was memorizing every detail for a later accounting. She had the quality of someone who has survived something before and has made the internal calculation that survival is a certainty rather than a hope, who is not pretending the situation is okay, but is not going to be broken by it either. Jessie breathed shallowly, the controlled breath of someone who had been managing fear for 6 weeks, and had gotten very good at keeping it contained. But she sat upright, not collapsed, holding herself together by main force of will. Both of them had already decided they were going to get out of this. Ruby found that more reassuring than any reassurance she could have offered. She had sent the message. She did not know if the number still worked, did not know if Iron Cane was still alive, still reachable, still the man her father had written down as a last resort, did not know if the area code she had guessed was correct. She knew her father. She knew that Clint Denton did not do anything carelessly. He had put that number in that ring for a reason, and he had made the ring the thing she would find because he knew her well enough to know she would eventually open the box and eventually look inside the compartment and eventually understand. She looked at her zip-tied wrists, at the ring still pressed between her palms. She thought about his hands, the same hands that had braided her hair and changed her oil and signed the papers that gave this garage to her in trust, sitting down here in this same basement and sealing a flash drive inside a gas tank and making sure the evidence would be found by someone who could use it. She was going to be that someone. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she was going to be that someone. The time passed the way it passed. Dale made his calls, and she could hear fragments of the logistics he was managing, and everything she heard confirmed what she already knew about the shape of what he had been running, and she filed it away in the methodical part of her mind that her father had trained, and that had never stopped running even in circumstances like this. "What did you do?" Ruby asked Jessie quietly when Dale stepped back toward the stairs to take a call. "Before, when you were home." Jessie looked at her sidelong. "Community college, nursing program. Good program." "It was a good program. Second year." "You are going back to it," Ruby said. Jessie looked at her for a long moment, the expression of someone who had been in a situation long enough to stop believing in outcomes and was now being asked to start again. "You really think someone is coming?" "I sent a message," Ruby said. "To someone my father trusted. My father was a careful man. He did not put that number in that ring because he thought it might help. He put it there because he knew it would." Amber made a sound from her right side. Not rude, just the sound of someone deciding to spend their limited reserves of optimism on the one option that existed. "How long do we wait?" Amber asked. "Until they come," Ruby said. "And if they do not come before Thursday, then we figure out something else." Amber looked at her. "Okay," she said. Just that word, the word of someone who had decided to trust the plan and was not going to argue about it. Ruby held the ring in her zip-tied hands, and she waited. At 5:48 a.m. the side door of the garage opened, not with the careful quiet of someone picking a lock, with a key. Ruby heard it from the basement, heard the soft click and the hinge, and then footsteps on the concrete floor above them moving quickly and purposefully toward the back of the building. Dale heard it too. He was on his feet, hand going to the weapon at his hip, positioning himself at the foot of the stairs. The footsteps stopped above the basement door, and then Bobby Nash's voice came through the wood, clear and carrying the particular authority of a voice that is done pretending to be something it is not. "Federal agent." Dale Harker, step away from the stairs. Dale's hand froze on his weapon. The bolt slid back. Bobby Nash came down those stairs with his hands visible and his badge clipped to his belt, and his expression carrying the controlled steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this moment in their head for 8 months and is now doing it in real life. He was not the quiet, deliberate mechanic she had known. He was a federal agent with a warrant and backup positioned outside, and the weight of 8 months of evidence behind him. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looked at Dale, looked at Ruby, at Jessie and Amber behind her. "I have got documentation on the network going back 11 years, Bobby said to Dale, not loudly, the way you speak to someone when you want them to understand you are not performing. Not just your piece of it, all of it. Every name, every transfer, every payment. You want to reach for that weapon, you think about what happens to you if you do, and then you make the choice that makes sense." Dale's hand moved away from his weapon. He sat down on the bottom step, placed his hands on his knees, and for the first time since Ruby had known him, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who had built something rotten and was now watching it fall on him. Federal agents came through the side door 40 seconds later. 3 in tactical gear, precise and efficient. 2 more from the front entrance. Outside, Ruby would learn later there were 4 additional vehicles and 12 federal agents, and somewhere beyond the police perimeter, positioned at every road in and out of a 6-block radius, 40 Hells Angels who had materialized from the Tennessee darkness and were making absolutely certain that no vehicle left this block without being seen. Bobby cut Ruby's zip ties with a folding knife. 2 precise movements. He held her wrists steady as he worked, and she felt the plastic give and the blood rush back into her hands with the pins and needles' intensity of restored circulation. "You sent the message," he said quietly. It was not a question. "I sent the message," she said. He nodded. "Then we have got a lot to do in the next few hours." "I know." She was already looking at the motorcycle under the tarp. "My father hid evidence in the Sportster, in the gas tank." Bobby looked at her, then at the tarp. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call, and the word he used was priority. At 6:14 a.m. Iron Cane walked through the side door of Denton's Custom Cycles. He was 61 years old. He was wearing his vest, his cut the Hells Angels Tennessee chapter patch that Clint Denton had worn before him, and he walked through that garage with the measured deliberateness of a man who had driven 4 hours through the dark because a dead friend's daughter had sent him a message and he had made a promise. He paused at the top of the stairs, looked at the garage around him. The tool wall hanging exactly as it had in Clint's day. The lifts, the workbench, the high windows. He had been in this space before 20 years ago when Clint had first bought the building and was showing it off with the particular pride of a man who had worked for something and arrived at it. Iron had stood here and drunk a beer and told Clint it was a good shop. He had meant every word. He came down the stairs. He looked at Ruby. She looked up at him. "You got my message," she said. "I got your message," he said. His voice was rough, careful. He came down and crouched in front of her, and she saw in his face something she had not expected recognition. Not just of her, not just of the situation, but of her specifically. Of Clint's daughter. Of the green eyes and the set of the jaw and the quality of steadiness under pressure that was her inheritance. He had known Clint for 20 years, had stood at his funeral and told himself it was an accident because that was easier than the alternative. He had waited 2 years when he should not have waited, and the only reason anything was salvageable now was because she had acted when he had not. "You look like him," Iron said. "I know," she said. "People always said that." He nodded once, slow, looked at Jesse and Amber at the federal agents working the room at Dale Harker being escorted up the stairs. "We have work to do," he said. "Yes," she said. They got to work. The Sportster's tank was opened under chain of custody protocols. Inside the tank, sealed in a waterproof case, no larger than a deck of cards, was a flash drive. On that flash drive was 2 years of Clint Denton's documentation. Spreadsheets, names, dates, transaction records showing money moving through a shell company linked to the garage, photographs taken covertly of individuals coming and going at hours that matched known transfer timelines, recorded phone calls, Clint's voice on 6 of them asking questions, receiving answers, the voice of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what it was going to cost him, and a video file. They played it in the FBI field vehicle parked outside the garage. Bobby Nash and Iron Cane and Ruby Denton standing in the narrow vehicle looking at a laptop screen. Clint Denton's face filled the frame. He had recorded it on a phone propped against something on a workbench, the garage visible behind him. He was wearing a flannel shirt. Ruby recognized one she had tried to throw away twice and kept retrieving from the donation pile because it still smelled like him. He looked directly into the camera. "If you are watching this," he said, "then I am gone. And either Ruby found this or someone I trusted found it, which means the right people are seeing it." He paused. "I have been building this case for 14 months. Started because I caught Dale moving a girl through the shop last March. Thought at first it was a one-time thing. Then I saw the pattern. Then I understood what the pattern meant. He gave names, dates, locations. The organized, methodical testimony of a man who had spent 30 years in a world that required precision and had turned that precision into documentation. The final name he gave was not Dale Harker. The final name was Senator Paul Whitmore. Paul Whitmore, Clint said quietly. Tennessee State Senate, currently running for U.S. Senate. He is the money, not the operation. He does not get his hands dirty. But the shell company that the payments run through traces back to a holding company incorporated in Delaware in 2011, and that company has one principal officer. He is the protection. The reason cases disappear. The reason people who ask questions end up having accidents. Ruby heard Iron make a sound beside her, something that was not quite a word. I know this is going to be hard to prove, Clint continued. That is why I have spent 14 months building the paper trail. Everything on this drive should be enough to give investigators what they need to pull the financial thread. But you have to pull it fast because Whitmore has friends everywhere, and the moment he hears the investigation is coming, he is going to start severing connections, and the window will close. He looked at the camera for a moment. Ruby, if you are the one watching this, I need you to know something. I kept you out of this on purpose. Every choice I made to keep you in the dark was me trying to keep you safe. I know that probably felt like being left out. I know you have spent your whole life watching me handle things alone and wondering why I did not ask for help. He paused. I am asking for help now, from whoever is standing in this room with you. Trust Iron if he is there. Trust the process if the FBI is there. Do not try to do this alone. You are brave enough for anything, Ruby May. But brave does not mean solitary. The recording ended. Ruby stood in the FBI vehicle for a long moment with her father's voice still in the air. Iron was beside her, and neither of them spoke. She thought about what it meant to hear a voice you had not heard in 2 years. Not a recording played for memory's sake, not the way you play a saved voicemail until you have worn the audio flat. A new communication. Words her father had said into a camera, specifically to be found, specifically for this moment, which he had anticipated and prepared for even as he was running out of time. He had known she would be the one watching. He had bet his case on her, on the daughter he had raised with braided hair and a pocket knife, and 30 years of his particular knowledge of how to survive in a world that was frequently hostile. She had followed the thread he laid. She had not done it gracefully or without mistakes. She had done it with the tools she had and the faith that the number in the ring was real and the person attached to it would come. He would have liked you being here, she said to Iron. Iron was quiet for a moment. He cleared his throat. I should have been here 2 years ago. Should have pushed harder when I felt something wrong. You came when you were needed, she said. I came when you called. He paused. He would have called earlier, been smarter about it than I was. You are here now, she said. He nodded. His jaw was tight. We both waited too long, she said. Iron looked at her. Yes, and we are here now, same as you said. She looked at the garage through the vehicle's windshield, at the federal agents moving in and out, at the evidence technicians, at the particular organized activity of a scene being properly processed. Her father had built a case for 14 months and sealed it inside a gas tank and waited. The case was open now. Then she said, Senator Paul Whitmore is currently in Nashville. He has a fundraiser at the Hermitage Hotel tomorrow night. Bobby Nash looked at her. How do you know that? He came into the diner 3 weeks ago with his campaign manager, and I served them coffee, and the campaign manager left a schedule printout on the counter, and I kept it because I read everything that comes through the diner, and I never throw anything away. She pulled her phone from her boot, found the photo she had taken of the schedule, showed it to Bobby. He took the phone, looked at the screen, then stepped outside and made a call. The call that connected the morning's events in Clarksville to a federal warrant being drawn up in Nashville. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, the warrant had been issued, reviewed by a federal judge who had been insulated from Whitmore's network due to a recent appointment, and approved. Wednesday evening, at 6:43 p.m., Senator Paul Whitmore was arrested in the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee, 4 minutes before the doors opened for his campaign fundraiser. He was wearing a dark suit and a flag pin and a smile that had been professionally calibrated for maximum trustworthiness. He stopped smiling when he saw the federal badges. He said there must be some misunderstanding, in the voice of a man who had said those words before and found them effective. Agent Sarah Bennett, who led the arrest team and who had spent 11 months building toward this moment, looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard that sentence too many times to find it meaningful. "There is not," she said. "Please come with us." The fundraiser crowd that had been gathering on the sidewalk watched. Some of them had cameras. The images were in the news by morning. The political career built on the appearance of trustworthiness was over in the span of 14 seconds between the moment the agents identified themselves and the moment the handcuffs clicked. But the arrest was not the end. An arrest was just the beginning of a process that could still go wrong in 100 ways. Whitmore had lawyers. Whitmore had connections. Whitmore had a political machine that would not stop simply because he had been arrested. Bobby Nash sat with Ruby at Dusty's diner on Wednesday morning and laid it out carefully. He was no longer performing the cover. He was an FBI agent with 8 months of evidence, and he sat across the counter and spoke with the direct precision of someone who had something important to say and was not going to ornament it. The problem, he said, is that Whitmore's lawyers will argue the financial connections are circumstantial, that Clint's documentation, while compelling, is the testimony of a deceased person and subject to authentication challenges, that Dale Harker's cooperation comes with credibility problems given his own charges. He looked at her. What they need is a witness who can speak to the connection between Whitmore and the operation directly, someone who can establish direct knowledge, someone like Jesse Calloway who heard phone calls, who was present when names were used. He paused. Or someone who has Clint Denton's evidence in its entirety and can speak to the context of how it was collected. Ruby looked at her coffee cup, at the diner around her, at Terry behind the counter. "You are saying I need to testify." "I am saying you are the most credible witness we have to the full scope of this, because you are Clint Denton's daughter, and everything he built points toward you as the intended recipient of his evidence. His video was meant for you. His documentation was built so that you could carry it forward if he could not." She thought about what her father had said on the recording. "You are brave enough for anything, Ruby May, but brave does not mean solitary." She had been alone for 2 years. She had handled everything alone because she had not known she had another option. She looked up at Bobby Nash and saw underneath the FBI agent's careful professional presentation the same thing she had first noticed about him 8 months ago through the cover and the caution. Attentive, careful, present in a way that was not performance. "You should have told me," she said, "at some point in 8 months." "I know," he said. "You could have. When I asked you at the diner, you could have told me enough that I would not have gone in alone Tuesday morning." "I know." He looked at his hands. "I was trying to protect the case, and I was trying to protect you. They were the same goal, and then they were not, and I made the wrong call about which one mattered more." She considered this. "My father made the same call," she said. "Kept me out of it to protect me. Got himself killed anyway." Bobby did not say anything. "That is not the same as this," said Iron from the booth behind them. "He is not Clint. He is not running the same operation. He made a call you can agree with or not, but it came from the same place." Ruby looked at Iron, then at Bobby. "What do I need to do?" she said. The preparation took 3 days. Sandra Reeves, The assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case was 44 years old and had been working federal trafficking cases for 16 years. She had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having seen too much and deciding to do something about it rather than stop seeing. She met with Ruby every morning in a conference room at the federal building in Nashville, thorough, in the way that people are thorough when they understand that thoroughness is the only real defense against things going wrong. She reviewed Clint's flash drive twice in its entirety. She read Bobby's 8 months of supplementary documentation. She interviewed Jesse Calloway and Amber Wells in sessions that were careful and professional, and that she handled with the particular combination of precision and compassion that distinguished people who did this work because they meant it from people who did it as a career step. And she worked with Ruby on her testimony, not shaping it, not coaching her on what to say, helping her organize what she knew and what she had experienced and what the evidence meant in the context of her own relationship with her father. She asked questions and let Ruby answer, and only redirected when Ruby was being imprecise or when a line of testimony might invite objections they were not prepared to handle. The work was harder than anything Ruby had ever done, not because it was complicated, because it was true. Telling the truth in a structured, organized way in a format that a jury of 12 strangers could follow and that a skilled defense attorney could not dismantle required a kind of discipline different from, and in some ways more demanding than the discipline of surviving a basement or driving 4 hours in the dark. It required her to sit with her father's death and look at it clearly and describe it in plain language without the protection of anger or grief or the distance that time creates. It required her to say in front of strangers that her father had been building a case and had died for it, and that she was here to finish what he started. She practiced this. She said it to Sandra Reeves, and she said it to the wall of the conference room when Reeves stepped out, and she said it to herself in the bathroom mirror of the federal building in the evenings when the prep sessions had ended. She said it until the words carried the weight they needed to carry without the weight carrying her. On the second day of prep, Sandra Reeves set down her legal pad and looked at Ruby for a moment without the professional filter. "You know," she said, "I have prepared a lot of witnesses. In 16 years, dozens. Most of them are carrying something they were given without consent, something done to them or taken from them. And they come into my prep room trying to protect themselves from having to relive it while making the legal system understand what happened. That tension is very hard to work with." She looked at Ruby. "You are carrying something different. You are carrying something you chose to pick up. That is unusual. It changes the quality of the testimony in ways that matter." Ruby thought about the box, about the ring, about driving to the garage in the dark because she could not wait the 72 hours she had promised. "I did not feel like I chose it," she said finally. "It felt like the only thing that made sense." That is what choosing looks like, Reeves said, when it is real. She practiced until she could say it without her voice breaking, not because she was ashamed of feeling it, but because in a courtroom a steady voice carries more weight than a shaking one, and her father deserved the full weight of what she was carrying. Iron sat outside the prep room every day. He did not come in uninvited. He did not offer advice she had not asked for. He was just there the way her father used to be there, steady and solid and present in a way that said, whatever happens next, you are not alone in it. Hawk Torres arrived from Fort Smith on the second day and set up what he called a base of operations in a conference room 3 blocks from the courthouse, coordinating the witness infrastructure, ensuring that the 14 other witnesses in the case had secure transportation, that Jesse and Amber had the support they needed to prepare their own testimony, that the financial documentation had been triple verified by independent forensic accountants who could speak to the paper trail Clint had assembled. He worked 20-hour days with the focused efficiency of a man with something to prove to himself. Bobby Nash was a federal witness with his own counsel and his own testimony to prepare and his own complicated feelings about 8 months of living a life that was not his. He was professional and precise in the way of someone doing their job under difficult circumstances. He was also in the building every time Ruby was, not adjacent to her in a way that could be read as strategic, just present the way that certain people are present when they have something unresolved and are not yet ready to resolve it. She noticed this the way she noticed things her father had trained her to notice. She filed it away. The trial lasted 11 days. She testified on day 4. She wore a dark blue dress she had bought at a Goodwill the day before. Clean, simple, not performative. She wore her father's ring on a chain around her neck because it did not fit her finger, and she wanted it near her anyway. She walked to the stand and sat down and was sworn in and looked at the jury, 12 people who had been selected with care, who represented something she was choosing to believe in, even though she had every reason not to. The courtroom had a specific quality of attention she had not anticipated. She had been in rooms with many people before, but this was different. This was a room where everyone had arrived specifically to listen, where the architecture was designed to focus attention toward the center, where what she said would be written down and preserved and used. She had thought this would feel like pressure. It felt like responsibility, which was different. Pressure compresses you. Responsibility gives you a reason to expand into the space. She had prepared for this. She had sat in a conference room for 3 days and practiced being precise, and now she used that precision the way she used a torque wrench, with the right amount of force applied in exactly the right place. Sandra Reeves walked her through it carefully. The ring, the paper inside it, the phone, the messages, the box she had been avoiding for 2 years, the morning she had gone to the garage and heard something wrong, the basement, the women she had found, the moment Dale had come down the stairs and she had understood what her father had known. She described the flash drive, the Sportster, the protocol her father had used to conceal it. She described watching the video. When she reached that part of her testimony, Sandra Reeves paused and looked at her with the particular professional attentiveness of someone asking, without words, "Are you okay to continue?" Ruby took a breath, thought about what her father had said in the recording. "You are brave enough for anything, Ruby May, but brave does not mean solitary," she continued. She described the video in detail. Her father's voice, his flannel shirt, his face, which she had not seen in 2 years except in photographs, moving and speaking, and real in a way that photographs could not capture. She described what he had said. She did not cry during this part. She felt something during it that was too large and too precise to be called any single emotion. She described it as accurately as she could to the jury and let them feel what they were going to feel. From somewhere in the gallery, she heard a sound quickly stifled. Someone who had not been expecting what they heard. She kept her eyes on Sandra Reeves, and then on the jury, and then on her own hands folded in her lap when she needed a moment to gather herself. The defense cross-examined her for 40 minutes. They tried 3 different approaches, attacking the foundation of her relationship with her father as too close to be objective, questioning the chain of custody of the flash drive, and suggesting that her testimony about the video was colored by grief. She answered each question precisely. She did not editorialize. She had learned from watching Sandra Reeves that precision was more powerful than passion in a courtroom, that the clearest answer was the one most resistant to challenge. At the end of the cross-examination, the defense attorney said, "Miss Denton, you loved your father." "Yes." "And you believe he was murdered?" "Yes." "And you are here today because you want someone to be held accountable for that." "I am here today because my father built a case for 2 years and died before he could present it, and someone has to finish what he started." She paused. "He built it for me to finish. I am finishing it." The defense attorney sat down. She stepped down from the stand and walked back to her seat and did not look at the jury because she had said what she had to say, and the rest was not in her hands. Iron was in the gallery. When she sat down, he leaned forward slightly and put one large hand briefly on her shoulder. No words, just the weight of it, solid and real. Senator Paul Whitmore was convicted on 11 counts, including conspiracy to commit human trafficking, bribery of a public official, accessory to murder in the death of Clint Denton, and obstruction of justice. The jury deliberated for 9 hours and came back on the afternoon of the 11th day. Ruby sat in the gallery and heard each count announced and each guilty verdict returned, and held her father's ring on its chain in her closed fist. Dale Harker had pleaded guilty on day 1 of the trial in exchange for his cooperation and was sentenced separately. 40 years. He would die in a federal penitentiary. He was 45 years old, and he would never be free again. The man who had sat at her father's kitchen table and stood at his funeral and told a 20-year-old girl that everything would be okay. She found that she felt nothing about this that resembled mercy, and she did not try to feel otherwise. Marcus Webb, whose name had appeared throughout Clint's documentation and whose network Bobby's 8 months of undercover work had mapped in its entirety, had been arrested 3 weeks earlier in Memphis. The investigators working Webb's case found records pointing to 43 prior transactions, 43 prior names, a ledger of human beings reduced to transfer amounts and pickup schedules spread across 11 years of operation. The number sat in Ruby's chest like a stone. 43 before Jesse and Amber. 43 before anyone had opened a basement door. She thought about her father catching the first one, March 2 years ago, deciding that he could not unsee it. Working in secret for 14 months building a case with his own hands because he had not known who to trust, and dying before the process he had set in motion could reach its conclusion. She thought about that a great deal in the weeks after the verdict, about the cost of doing things alone, about the gap between what one person could accomplish and what became possible when you trusted the right people. Clint had not been wrong to be careful. He had been careful and methodical and thorough, and it had still cost him his life. Careful was not always enough, but the opposite of careful was not reckless. The opposite of careful was trust combined with care, the use of other people's judgment alongside your own, the building of a structure that could survive a single person's loss because it was not dependent on a single person. That was what he had been trying to do when he reached out to the FBI. He had just not lived long enough to see it work. She was going to see it work. That was the whole of her intention. The senator's trial ran concurrently with some of the network's other prosecutions. Sandra Reeves managed the government's case with the systematic precision of someone who had spent 16 years making sure that the people who paid to make cases disappear discovered that the payment had not worked. She was thorough, and she was relentless, and she had Clint's documentation, and Bobby's 8 months, and Ruby's testimony, and Jesse Calloway's account of the phone calls she had heard during 6 weeks in a basement that included Senator Whitmore's name said aloud twice by Dale Harker in the context of payment confirmations. Whitmore's defense was expensive and skilled. It argued financial coincidence and misidentification and the unreliability of testimony from traumatized witnesses and the authentication problems of documentation assembled by a deceased person. It argued these things clearly and professionally. It did not work. The paper trail Clint had built was not the work of an amateur. It was the work of a man who had spent 30 years understanding how documentation had to be structured in order to survive scrutiny, a man who had lived in a world where the difference between a claim that could be proven and one that could not was often the difference between freedom and a cell. He had applied that understanding to 14 months of careful record-keeping, and the result was a trail that held under pressure, that answered questions before they were asked, that connected each piece to the next with the methodical precision of someone who had anticipated every challenge. Ruby had known her father was careful. She had not known how deep the carefulness went. She knew now. Ruby learned the verdict from Bobby, who called her the moment it was announced. She was behind the counter at Dusty's with the lunch rush in progress, and she stepped into the back hallway where the sound level dropped enough to hear him clearly. He said 11 counts. All guilty. She leaned against the wall. The sound of the diner came through the door, plates, voices, the coffee maker, the ordinary percussion of a place that had been here before and would be here after. My father would have been here for this, she said. Bobby was quiet for a moment. Yes, he would have been. She went back to work. She had a table waiting and an order to take and a diner that needed her present. She was present. Jessie Calloway went home to Nashville. Her family held a small gathering at their house the week after she was released from the hospital, where she had spent 4 days being treated for malnutrition and the accumulated effects of 6 weeks of captivity. She called Ruby the morning she was discharged and talked for 40 minutes, asking about what would happen next, about whether it was safe, about what Ruby's life looked like now. Jessie asked if Ruby would come to the family gathering. Ruby drove to Nashville and sat in a stranger's living room and was fed more food than she had eaten in a week by Jessie's mother, a small, determined woman who refilled every plate the moment it showed any sign of emptying, as if she could repair 6 weeks of harm with enough home cooking. The gathering was loud and warm and full of people who had spent 6 weeks in a particular kind of terror and were now on the other side of it. Ruby sat at the table and ate and felt for a few hours like she was part of something rather than beside it. She drove back to Clarksville that night with a container of leftover casserole on the passenger seat and the particular feeling of someone who has been reminded what it is like to belong somewhere. She kept the feeling. She let herself keep it, which was different from the 2 years she had spent letting things go because holding them felt too much like needing them. She was allowed to need things. Her father had needed help and had not asked for it early enough and had died for it. She was not going to make the same mistake. Jessie went back to the nursing program in the fall. She called Ruby the first day of the semester before classes started and said, "I am going in. I just wanted to tell someone who would understand why it matters that I am going in." Ruby said, "It matters. Go." Amber Wells sent a text 2 weeks after the verdict that said only "thank you" for opening the door. She enrolled in a self-defense course the month after her release, completed the certification, then went back and got the instructor's certification. She was teaching classes in Bowling Green by spring. She sent Ruby a photograph of her certification card with a short message. "I figured if I could not get out of a zip tie in a basement, I should learn how. Better late than never." Ruby sent back, "Better late than never is the whole story of everything good that ever happened." Bobby Nash left Clarksville the day after the verdict. He came into the diner before he left. Ruby was behind the counter. Back to work. Terry had given her 3 weeks off after the arrest and then looked at her the way she had looked at her the day she hired her, direct and assessing, and said, "You ready?" And Ruby had said yes, because the diner was the thing that kept her present, and she needed to be present now more than ever. Bobby came in and sat at the counter. He did not order anything. "I wanted to say I am sorry," he said, "for the call I made at the diner. The 72 hours. You should not have been in that basement." "I know," she said. "And I know why you made it." She wiped down the counter. "You were trying to protect both things at once, and they could not both be protected." "Yeah." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the diner window, Clarksville went about its Tuesday morning ordinary and continuous and unchanged in its surface by everything that had happened under it. "You could have told me who you were sooner," she said. "At some point in 8 months. At some point in 8 months I wanted to," he said. "That is not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It is not nothing." He put a card on the counter. The Louisville field office number and his direct extension. "If you need anything," he said. "Anything related to the case, any follow-up, any concerns. And if it is not related to the case." He looked at her for a moment. "That number works for that too," he said. He walked out. She watched him go, filed it away in the place where she kept things that needed time. 3 months after the verdict, on a Saturday in August, Ruby Mae Denton signed the paperwork transferring Denton's custom cycles into her own name. The trust had been dissolved by court order following Dale's conviction. The shop had been closed during the investigation and trial. The physical space had been cleared, cleaned, fumigated of its history. The basement had been demolished and filled in with concrete at Ruby's specific request. She had stood in the garage when they poured it, watching the gray fill the hole where the utility room had been, the hole where Jesse and Amber had sat in the dark for weeks, and she had watched until the surface was smooth and flat, and there was nothing left to see. She had not cried during the demolition. She had watched it with the particular quality of attention she had developed over the past months, the attention of someone who understands that some things need to be witnessed completely in order to be properly closed. The concrete had taken 4 hours to cure to the point where you could walk on it. She had stayed the whole time. Before going to the courthouse, she stood in the garage alone. Just stood in it. Listened to the building. The creak of the metal roof in the August heat, the faint traffic from Commerce Street, the smell of oil and metal that would never fully leave because it was built into the walls, into the floor, into the air of the place. She had grown up here. She had done homework at that bench. She had her initials under the stool. She had also, in the darkness of an early Tuesday morning, used this space for the purpose her father had built it, for protecting people in whatever way the moment required. The building was still Denton's. Whatever had happened in it, the building itself was still the building her grandfather had put up, and her father had shaped into something he was proud of, and that now belonged to her. Iron had driven up from Fort Smith for the signing. He sat in the waiting area of the county courthouse in his vest and his patches and looked completely incongruous and completely unbothered by this. When the county clerk handed Ruby the pen and looked at the man sitting against the wall, Iron met her gaze and nodded pleasantly. She nodded back and said nothing. Clarksville was a town that knew how to mind its business when minding its business was appropriate. Ruby signed her name, Ruby Mae Denton. The letters she had been practicing in the margins of school notebooks since she was 7 years old, the signature that was her father's name and her own name, and the inheritance built over 2 generations on this particular street. Afterward, they went to Dusty's. Terry brought coffee without being asked, sat down across from them, uninvited, the prerogative of a woman who had been feeding people for 40 years, and understood that some conversations needed witness. "What are you going to do with it?" Iron asked. Ruby turned the ring on her finger. It fit now. She had had a local jeweler resize it in the weeks after the trial, a small adjustment that made it hers instead of borrowed. "I am going to run it," she said. "The garage. Do it right. The way he would have wanted." He nodded. "And the other thing," she said. Iron raised an eyebrow. She had been thinking about this for 3 months, thinking about what Bobby had said in the prep room, what Sandra Reeves had said about Clint's documentation being built for a jury to follow, thinking about the 14 witnesses in the trial and the 6 children recovered from Marcus Webb's network and Jesse Calloway coming home to Nashville, thinking about how her father had spent 2 years building a case alone because he had not known how to ask for help and had not trusted the systems and had tried to handle it himself and had died because of it. "There are other garages," she said. "Other businesses being used as fronts. Other operations that somebody knows about but cannot document alone. Other people in the position my father was in who see something wrong and do not know where to take it and do not have 2 years to build a case by themselves." Iron looked at her. "You are thinking about what we could do with a network," she said. "Not just Arkansas and Tennessee. All of it. Brothers in every state who know their communities, who hear things, who see things. A proper channel for getting that information to people who can do something with it. That is not a small thing to set up." "No," she said, "it is not." He was quiet for a moment. Terry refilled his cup without being asked, and he nodded his thanks, and she went back behind the counter without saying anything. Outside, a motorcycle went past the sound of it opening up on the empty stretch of Commerce Street. the particular note of a Harley engine in second gear that Ruby had known since before she could walk. Then Iron said your father had the same instinct. That is why he reached out to the FBI. He understood that individual effort has limits, and the only thing that beats a network is a bigger network. He wanted to do it right, she said. He just ran out of time. Iron nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup, set it back down. He would be proud of you, he said. Not just for this, for all of it. Ruby had been very careful with herself during the 3 months since the verdict. She had cried exactly once in her car in the parking lot outside the courthouse on the day the sentencing was handed down 15 minutes by herself before she dried her face and drove back to work. She had been deliberate about that, about not letting the grief out in pieces and fragments, about holding it until she could hold it completely. She had learned this from her father. He had grieved in the way of people who understand that grief is weight that has to be carried somewhere, and who choose to carry it in motion, in work, in the daily accumulation of things done well, rather than in the stillness that lets it sit on your chest. She had inherited this. She had not known it was an inheritance until she looked at herself over the past 3 months and recognized the pattern. There were mornings when she woke and the weight of everything that had happened was the first thing she felt before the light, before the sound of the street outside, before any of the details of the day. Those mornings she made her coffee and stood at the window and let the weight settle into a configuration she could carry, and then she got dressed and went to work. She let it go now. Not dramatically, not with sound. Just her eyes filling and one careful breath, and the ring solid on her hand and Iron across the table and Terry's hand over hers and the coffee getting cold between them. She had been alone for 2 years. She was not alone now. That was the thing that broke the careful holding. Not the grief for her father, which she had been managing and would manage for a long time, but the simple present tense fact of not being alone, of sitting at a table in Dusty's diner with people who had shown up when she needed them, one of them because she had asked, and one of them because she had always been there and had simply been waiting for Ruby to be ready to let her be present. Nobody said anything. Outside Clarksville moved through its Saturday morning, the street, the diner, the ordinary world that continued at its own pace regardless of what had happened beneath it. The organization they built over the following year was called Clint's Watch. Informal, deliberately informal. Not a law enforcement agency, not a vigilante group. Something in between a community intelligence network that fed information to federal law enforcement through structured channels that protected the source and preserved the evidence. Getting it built required the kind of patience that is different from endurance. Endurance is surviving something. Patience is building something day by day with no guarantee that the structure will hold. Ruby made calls. She drove to chapters in Arkansas and Mississippi and Kentucky and Georgia. She sat in roadside diners and parking lots and the back rooms of garages and spoke to men who had been told for decades that the instinct to protect their communities was incompatible with the systems that were supposed to do the same job, and who had discovered that it was not incompatible, but that nobody had built the bridge between them. She spoke about her father, about what he had seen and what he had done and what it had cost. She spoke plainly without oratory, the way her father had spoken, and she found that plain speech from someone who had earned the right to it carried a kind of authority that no amount of performance could replicate. There were difficult conversations. Not everyone she spoke to was convinced. Some of the men she met had histories with law enforcement that were not the kind of histories that made cooperation feel natural, and they said so directly, and she respected that directness and answered it with the same. She was not asking anyone to trust the system. She was asking them to trust a structure that existed between themselves and the system, a layer of human judgment and community knowledge that filtered what went up the chain and how. She had to explain this many times in many different ways before it landed, and in some rooms, it never landed, and she drove away from those rooms without the commitment she had hoped for, and with a clearer understanding of what she was actually building, which was not a thing that could be imposed or sold, which was a thing that had to make sense on its own terms to the people who were going to use it. Some of those rooms she came back to. Some of the men she had not convinced on the first visit she convinced on the third or fourth, when they had seen the results of what the structure was doing in other states and understood it from the output rather than the argument. She kept track of all of it, kept notes the way her father had kept notes methodically, with dates and names and the specific substance of what had been said and what had been agreed to and what was still in question. It was exactly what Clint had been doing in his 14 months of documentation, building a record, making sure the evidence existed even if she was not there to speak for it. The driving accumulated too. She put 40,000 miles on her truck in the first year of building the organization. She knew the highways of 9 states the way she knew Commerce Street by feel, by the particular rhythm of them, by the exits that led to diners worth stopping at, and the long stretches that required conversation with yourself to stay sharp. She carried a thermos and a legal pad and a notebook of contacts organized by chapter and state and level of commitment, the notebook growing thicker as the months passed, each added name a small confirmation that what she was building was real. Hawk Torres built the technical infrastructure, the secure reporting channel, the verification protocols, the connection points to FBI field offices across 9 states. He worked with the focus of a man who had spent years watching evidence disappear into bureaucratic channels and was now building a system specifically designed to prevent that from happening. There was one afternoon when Hawk put down his pen and looked at the wall where he had been mapping the structure and said quietly, "Your father would have had this running in 6 months. He was faster than me." Ruby was across the table with her own notes. She looked up. He had everything already, she said. He had built most of it. He just did not know he had built it. He thought he was collecting evidence. He was actually designing the model. Hawk looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the wall. Iron coordinated the human network, reaching out through 3 decades of connections, translating what Ruby was building into language that each chapter understood in its own terms. He did this without fanfare, without credit, with the particular invisible competence of someone who has been doing things for a long time and no longer needs acknowledgement. Bobby Nash, still assigned to Louisville, consulted on the federal compliance piece. He called once a week, sometimes twice. The calls were professionally scoped and also gradually not only professionally scoped. There were evenings when the case-related material was handled in the first 20 minutes and the remaining time was something else entirely, the easy, wandering conversation of 2 people who had been through something together and were finding out who they were to each other on the other side of it. She noticed this the way she noticed things. She let it develop at its own pace. In its first year of operation, Clint's watch provided actionable intelligence in 23 cases across 9 states. 14 resulted in arrests. 11 of those arrests were connected to networks that federal investigators had been tracking and could not crack because they lacked the community access that the Brotherhood provided. Numbers like that do not get reported the way verdicts do, but they accumulated. 23 families who did not spend an additional month not knowing where their person was. 14 people held accountable. 11 networks that lost a node and had to rebuild, and in rebuilding exposed themselves to further investigation. There was a morning in October, the 2nd October since the verdict, when Ruby came in for the early shift, and Terry was already at the counter with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, and she looked up when Ruby came through the door and said, "There is something in the paper about you." It was a small item, 2 column inches on the inside of the local section. An arrest in Nashville connected to a trafficking case. A brief mention that an intelligence tip had been provided through a community organization called Clint's Watch, which was described as a nonprofit safety network operating across 9 states. Ruby read it once, set the paper down, poured herself coffee. Terry watched her. Your dad would have been embarrassed by the press, Terry said. Ruby smiled. He would have been furious, but proud. Very proud, Ruby said. She put on her apron and went to work. Ruby ran the garage and ran the organization simultaneously. She hired 2 mechanics, both of them vetted carefully, both of them people who understood the job they were taking and the space they were working in. The garage was clean and honest and did exactly what it said it did, which was repair motorcycles and other vehicles with skill and fair pricing. Clint had built its reputation over 20 years, and Ruby maintained it with the same care she brought to everything she did. She restored her father's 1979 Harley-Davidson Sportster herself over 8 months of evenings and early mornings, learning the parts she did not know. The way her father had taught her to learn things slowly, with her hands making mistakes and correcting them, never moving on from a problem until she understood what had caused it. The process was not always straightforward. There were parts that required sourcing from collectors in 4 states. There were mechanical issues she had to solve by reading manuals her father had kept in a filing cabinet. In the back office, technical documents written in the specific language of people who built things to last. She worked through the manuals with the same methodical attention she had brought to Sandra Reeves's prep sessions. One evening in November, 6 months into the restoration, she found something that stopped her. Not a fault. A modification her father had made neatly done, completely invisible, unless you were looking for it, to a junction in the chassis wiring that would have allowed a small tracking device to be connected to the bike's power system without detection. She sat with that for a while. Then she traced the modification back through the wiring and understood he had been planning to put a GPS tracker on the bike. He had begun the modification and then stopped partway through, which meant he had already been thinking months before the accident about the possibility that his bike might need to be found. She photographed it and sent the photographs to Bobby Nash. He called back within the hour. They already knew, he said. There was a note in Clint's documentation about a tracking modification he had started and then decided against because the device would have required a signal that could be intercepted. He had concluded the risk was too high. She looked at the half-finished modification for a long time. He had thought of everything. He had thought of everything and done the best he could, and it still had not been enough to save his life. And the only reason the case existed at all was because he had understood that and prepared for it anyway. She finished the restoration with the modification left in place, not completed, not removed. Just there, the way he had left it, a record of a thought he had in the process of trying to keep himself safe. When the bike was finished, it did not look restored in the way of a showroom piece. It looked ridden, maintained alive. The way it had looked when her father owned it, when it had been a working machine rather than a retirement project. She rode it once around the block the evening she finished. Then she brought it inside and put it in the front window of the garage. Not for sale, never for sale, a display her father's project finally complete. She stood in front of it for a long time. He had put it in the basement 20 years ago and called it retirement savings and never gotten back to it. She had put 8 months into finishing what he had not gotten around to, and the result was standing in her window in the evening light, chrome and leather and 45 years of engineering that had been maintained and respected and now belonged to someone who understood what it was. She thought about what he had said in the recording. He had not said, "I am sorry I did not finish the bike." He had talked about the case and about asking for help and about trusting the right people. He had known what was important. On a Thursday morning, 14 months after the verdict, Bobby Nash came back to Clarksville. He was no longer undercover. He was no longer in Louisville. He had transferred after appropriate channels and processes to the Nashville field office, which was 60 miles from Clarksville, and which handled, among other things, the ongoing cases that had emerged from the Whitmore and Webb networks and the 14 parallel investigations that Clint's watch had contributed intelligence to over the past year. He came into the diner at 9 a.m. and sat at the counter. Ruby looked at him. He looked at her. He was wearing regular clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, work boots, not performing a cover, not carrying the deliberate neutrality of a man measuring how much to show, just a person in a diner on a Thursday morning. "Burger is not on the menu until 11, she said. "I know. You want coffee?" "Yeah." She poured it, set it down. Then she came back and said, "How long are you in Clarksville for?" "I was thinking," he said, "depending on certain things, possibly long term." She looked at him for a moment, at the card she had kept in the drawer of her nightstand for 14 months, slightly bent at one corner from being taken out and looked at and put back. "You should come see the garage," she said. I restored the Sportster. He smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had seen from him, the smile that had been there in small pieces during 8 months of lunches and had never quite gotten loose. "I heard about the Sportster. I would like to see it." "Tonight," she said. "Tonight." She went back to her tables. Through the window, she could see Clarksville going about its Thursday morning. The street, the buildings, the cars, the world that had been here before and would be here after. Her father's ring on her finger. The garage 3 blocks away. Terry behind the counter watching all of it with the patience of someone who has been watching people figure things out for 40 years. Bobby Nash worked the Nashville field office and drove to Clarksville on weekends and eventually stopped making the drive back on Sunday nights and then stopped making it at all. This development had its own timeline and its own pace and was arrived at in the same careful, incremental way that both of them arrived at things deliberately, with full attention, without rushing what did not need to be rushed. He was a good man, not in the uncomplicated way of someone who had never made a bad call, but in the more durable way of someone who understood the difference between a bad call and bad character and had spent the intervening time making sure the distinction was clear in everything he did. He met Iron for the first time not in a crisis, but over coffee at Dusty's on a Saturday morning, and Iron looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You made a bad call at the diner, and she did not leave you for it." "That tells me more about both of you than the call does," Bobby said. "I know." Iron said, "Good." Terry refilled their cups. There was a night in early spring, the spring after Bobby had stopped driving back to Nashville on Sunday evenings, when the two of them were in the garage after closing. Ruby working on a shovelhead she had taken in for a full rebuild, Bobby sitting on the stool at the workbench with her father's technical manuals spread around him, reading about torque specifications with the same methodical attention he brought to case files. He looked up at some point and said, "Your father annotated these." She did not look up from the head gasket she was aligning. "I know, in the margins. All of them." He paused. "Some of it is technical notes. Some of it is other things." He read aloud from wherever he had the manual open, check bearing by feel, not just spec, because some things you have to trust your hands. And then below that, Ruby understands this. Has since she was 12. She stopped what she was doing. Bobby set the manual down. He was looking at her the way he looked at most things, directly, without performance, with the attention of someone who understood that the moment was what it was and did not need to be made into anything larger. "He was right," she said finally. "I did understand it. I do. I know," he said. "I can see it." She went back to the head gasket. He went back to the manual. After a while he said quietly, and not looking up from the page, "I read the whole thing cover to cover. Not the technical parts. The other notes." He annotated every third or fourth page with something that was not about the machine. Observations. Things he noticed. Things he wanted to pass along. Ruby stopped again. "He had a whole page in the back," Bobby said. "Not technical, just a list. Things he wanted you to know. He had written your name at the top." She held very still. Bobby looked at her. "I did not read it. I saw your name and I stopped. But it is there. End of the manual for the 1979 Sportster. I thought you would want to know." She set down her tools. She walked to the workbench and picked up the manual and turned to the back, found the page. sat down on her father's stool and read it, and the overhead lights hummed and the street outside stayed quiet, and the garage smelled like oil and metal and home. Whatever the page said, it was between her and her father. She read it twice and held it, and then she set the manual down on the bench where his handwriting was still visible on every page, and the Sportster was in the window, and the ring was on her hand. Everything that needed to be there was there. 6 months after that Thursday, on a morning in spring with the dogwoods coming in along Commerce Street and the air carrying the particular smell of Tennessee in April, she stood at the front of a conference room in a Holiday Inn outside Nashville at a meeting she had organized over 4 months of calls and emails and Iron's considerable organizational network. 43 people in the room, bikers from 9 states, 3 FBI agents in civilian clothes, a prosecutor from Sandra Reeves's office, a woman from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, representatives from 2 victim advocacy organizations, Hawk Torres in the back row with a legal pad and the look of someone who had been working toward this particular meeting for 2 years. Ruby was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, her father's flannel, the one she had kept finding in the donation pile. She had washed it until it no longer smelled like him, and then worn it until it smelled like her, and that felt like the right progression of things. She stood at the front of the room and said, "My name is Ruby Mae Denton. My father was Clint Denton, president of the Hells Angels Tennessee chapter until 2 years ago. He spent the last 2 years of his life building a case against a trafficking network that was using his garage as a transit point. He was killed before he could present it. I finished it." She paused. "What I want to talk about today is what comes next, not just for this network which has been dismantled, for the next network, and the one after that." She talked about the structure she had been building, a formal reporting channel with a human layer in between, a network of people embedded in communities who could provide context and credibility to tips before they went up the formal chain. The thing Clint had not had. A middle step between isolated witness and overwhelmed federal system. She talked about the bikers' existing network, the eyes they had in every town, the trusted outsider status that made people talk to them when they would not talk to police, the infrastructure already in place, decades of it brotherhood built into the geography of every state. She talked about the 43 names in Marcus Webb's ledger. She talked about her father's ring and what he had put inside it. And she said he built the case alone because he did not know how to ask for help. I do not want anyone else to have to do that alone. I do not want the next Clint Denton to die in a ditch on Highway 48 because they were trying to protect their community by themselves and did not know there was another way. The room was quiet when she finished. The quiet lasted about 10 seconds. Then the man in the front row, a road captain from a Mississippi chapter who had not said a word during the entire 4-hour drive to Nashville that he had told Hawk Torres he was not sure this meeting was worth, said, "So what you are describing is essentially a network that exists to protect the people who are trying to protect their communities." He paused. "A structure for the people who are already doing this work, but doing it alone." "Yes," Ruby said. "That is exactly what I am describing." He nodded. "I know 3 people in Mississippi who should be in this room." Ruby looked at him. "Then bring them to the next one," she said. Iron, seated in the second row, looked at her with an expression she had been learning to read over the past year and a half. Something that was not just pride. Something that was the combination of grief and recognition that happens when you see a person become what the person you lost would have wanted. He nodded once. The questions came after. Practical questions, logistical questions, questions about chain of custody and legal liability, and the boundaries of what the network could do without crossing lines that would compromise the prosecutions they were trying to support. Bobby handled some of the federal compliance questions. Hawk handled the technical ones. Ruby handled the ones about intention and structure and the reason for doing it this way rather than another way. She answered all of them the same way she had answered the defense attorney in the courtroom. Precisely, without oratory, with the plain directness of someone who had thought carefully about what they were building and why. The meeting ended at noon. By the end of the week, 27 of the 43 people in that room had signed on to the pilot structure. By the end of the month, that number was 61. Clint's watch became real in the way that things become real when enough people decide they are through accumulated effort and accumulated trust and the slow construction of a structure that can hold weight. There were setbacks. Months when a case that the network had flagged went nowhere because the evidence was insufficient or the jurisdiction complicated. Moments when the thing felt fragile, when the threads connecting all the pieces seemed thin and liable to snap under additional tension. Ruby had expected this. She had not expected to be as steady under it as she turned out to be, but she had expected it. Her father had spent 14 months building something alone with no guarantee it would hold, and he had kept building anyway. She had that as a model. The cases that did go forward went forward the way cases do, when they are built properly slowly. Then, all at once, the slow accumulation of evidence and witness testimony and financial documentation reaching a threshold beyond which the weight became undeniable. The arrests that came out of Clint's watch intelligence were solid arrests. The prosecutions that followed them were solid prosecutions, because the structure had been built specifically to ensure that what went up the chain was clean and verifiable and documented in ways that could survive a defense attorney's challenge. Sandra Reeves called her after the third successful prosecution connected to Clint's watch intelligence. "Your father would have been very good at this," Reeves said. "He was doing it for 2 years by himself," Ruby said. "He was already very good at it." Reeves paused. "You know," she said, "when I took the Whitmore case, I was told by 3 different people that it was unwinnable, that the financial paper trail was too abstract, and the deceased witness angle was too problematic, and the community source intelligence would be challenged on credibility grounds." Ruby was quiet for a moment. "But you took it. Your father spent 14 months building something that was designed to be taken seriously," Reeves said. "The least I could do was take it seriously." She paused again. "You should be proud of what you have built. Clint's watch is not a workaround. It is a model. I have had conversations with 3 U.S. attorneys who want to understand how it works." Ruby had the distinct sensation of something her father might have called a thing landing right. Not pride exactly. Something more structural than pride. Something that felt like confirmation that the way she had understood the problem was correct, that the solution she had built was answering the right question. She thanked Reeves and got off the phone and stood at the workbench in the garage for a long time, her hands on the surface that had been her father's surface and her grandfather's surface before that, the grain of it worn smooth in the places where hands had rested across decades of work. In the years that followed, Clint's watch was never large and never loud, and never the kind of thing that generated headlines. It was the kind of thing that generated cases. Tips that turned into warrants, that turned into arrests, that turned into trials, that turned into verdicts. It generated the particular category of result that does not make the news but changes the specific lives of specific people in ways that no general story can capture. Ruby ran it the way her father had built his documentation, methodically, carefully, with attention to detail and no tolerance for anything that would compromise what they were trying to accomplish. She ran the garage the same way. She kept working at Dusty's 3 mornings a week because she wanted the counter and the coffee and the ordinariness of it. She wanted the work that kept her present. Terry understood this without being told and never suggested she ought to be doing something more important instead. Terry had been watching people figure out their lives from behind a diner counter for 40 years, and she understood that the ordinariness was not in spite of what Ruby was doing, but part of it. The person who could pour your coffee and remember you took it light was also the person who could sit in a conference room full of bikers and FBI agents and hold the room. The 2 things were not in tension. They were the same instinct applied to different scales. On a morning in late autumn, 2 years after the verdict, Ruby rode the Sportster for the first time on a real road, not just around the block. She took it out on Highway 48, the same highway where her father had died, and she rode it at a pace that was not trying to outrun anything, just riding the way he had taught her, with her hands easy on the grips and her eyes on the road ahead and the engine doing what it had been built to do. She had avoided that highway for 2 years, not as a rule she had made for herself, just by choosing routes that did not require it. She had not decided to ride it today. She had just found herself pointed that direction and had let the road take her where it went. She rode for 40 minutes. The autumn light came sideways through the trees that lined the highway, gold and amber, the same light that had been here the October her father had ridden this road for the last time. The same road, different morning, the same engine tuned by her hands running steady under her. She passed the mile marker where the accident report had placed the crash. She did not slow down. She did not speed up. She rode past it at an even pace and felt what she felt about it, which was complicated and not reducible and had been 2 years in the forming. She did not try to simplify it. She let it be complicated and kept riding. She thought about what he had said in the recording, about asking for help, about the people in the room with her, about trust, about the ring, about the number he had written down for her, about the faith it represented, the faith of a man who knew he might not be there, but who was making sure she would not be alone, who had done everything he could to ensure that when she finally needed help, there was someone to call. That faith had been placed correctly. Help had come. She had asked for help, and help had come, and what remained now was the work which was not glamorous, and was not finished, and would never be finished, which was the point. She thought about that for a while, riding the highway in the autumn light. Then she turned around and rode back to Clarksville, back to the garage, back to the diner, back to the work that needed doing and the people who were doing it alongside her. There are things she understood standing in that garage on a November afternoon with the light coming through the high windows the way it always had, that she had not understood 2 years earlier when she stood in the same space at 20 years old with her father newly dead and the floor she had stood on all her life suddenly uncertain. She understood that the people who look frightening are not always the people to fear. She had lived this. Dale Harker had been familiar and comfortable and paternal, and he had killed her father and intended to sell her. Iron Cane had arrived at dawn from 4 hours away, wearing a leather vest with a skull on the back, and had cut the zip ties from her wrists with the care of someone who understood that the person in front of him was not a problem to be managed, but a person who needed to get home. The appearances had been exactly backward. Not in a surprising way once she had seen it. In the way that things that are obviously true in retrospect often seem that they should have been obvious all along. She understood that asking for help was not a defeat. It was the thing that made the rest possible. Her father had understood this too in the last months of his life when he had reached out to the FBI and built his parallel communication channel and put a phone number in a ring. He had understood it late and had not survived the delay. She had found the evidence of his understanding and used it as the foundation for everything she had built since. She thought sometimes about what he would have done differently if he had lived, if the case had gone forward on his terms and his timeline. He would have been systematic about it, thorough, careful. He would have built the same bridges she had built, would have made the same calls, would have driven to the same rooms and spoken with the same directness and earned the same slow trust. He would have been better at some parts of it than she was. She knew this and did not find it diminishing. He had 30 years of relationships she was still building. He had knowledge of the brotherhood's geography that she was still acquiring. He had an instinct for when to push and when to wait that she was still developing. But she was building it. Day by day, case by case, call by call. She understood that the work of building safety is never finished and never dramatic and never sufficient, but is always worth doing. that the 23 cases in Clint's watch's first year were not a solution to the problem they addressed, that the solution to a problem this large is not a single organization or a single case or a single verdict, but an accumulation of structures and commitments and individual decisions made by individual people in individual moments. The decision to look instead of look away, the decision to call instead of stay silent, the decision to drive 4 hours through the dark because someone sent a message, and that was enough. She understood that her father had died alone on Highway 48 because he had not yet built the structure that would have made his survival possible, and that the structure she was building would not save every Clint Denton, but it would save some of them, and that some was the only number that could be built toward. She thought about Iron, about the way he had looked at her that first morning in the garage when he came down the stairs, and she looked up at him. He had said, "You look like him." She had said, "I know." And what she had meant, though she had not had the words for it yet, was, "I am trying to be like him. I am trying to take what he built and continue it and make it better, and that is the only honoring of his life that I know how to do." She was doing it. The work never ended. She had understood this from the beginning, and the understanding had not made it easier or harder, just clearer. There was always going to be another case, another tip, another person somewhere in this country who had seen something wrong and needed to know there was a place to take it. That was not a discouraging truth. It was the truth that made the work permanent, that gave it a permanence no single case or verdict could provide. You did not build Clint's watch to solve trafficking. You built it to make the solving of trafficking incrementally more possible, one case at a time, one bridge at a time, one decision by one person to pick up the phone instead of look away. Incremental, steady, sustained. Her father's way of working, her way of working. She stood in the garage with the light coming in through the windows, and her father's ring on her finger, and his flannel on the hook, and his Sportster in the window, and a shovelhead on the lift that needed her attention, and she thought, this is the work. This is the whole of it. And then she picked up her tools, and she went back to work. There are people like Clint Denton in every city and town and county in this country. People who see something wrong and decide they cannot unsee it, who try to do something about it with what they have alone because they do not know how to ask for the help they need or do not believe the help will come. Some of them survive it, some of them do not. The ones who do not leave things behind, a ring, a phone, a flash drive in a gas tank, the last communication of someone who understood they were running out of time and tried to make the time count. Those things need to be found. Those cases need to be finished. There are Ruby Dentons, too. People who open the box, even when it is hard, who send the message, even when they do not know if anyone will answer, who stand at the bottom of a flight of stairs between harm and the people behind them and wait for someone to hear. The waiting is the hard part. The not knowing is the hard part. The having done everything you can and not knowing if it will be enough is the hard part. But sometimes someone hears. Sometimes the message finds the right person. Sometimes the right people make the right calls and the right structure exists to receive the information, and the result is that a door gets opened and the people behind it get to go home. The world is full of people who almost looked, who noticed something and then looked away, who decided it was not their business, or they might be wrong, or it would be awkward to say something, who made the easier choice and lived with it. And the world is full of people who did look, who asked the question, who made the call, who drove 4 hours through the dark because a dead friend's daughter sent a message, and that was enough. The gap between those two groups is not talent or training or courage in the abstract sense. It is a decision made in a specific moment about whether the discomfort of acting is worth it compared to the cost of not acting. Clint Denton made that decision. It cost him his life, and it saved other lives, and the ledger of that is not simple and will not resolve into anything clean or comfortable. His daughter made the same decision at 4 a.m. in a garage she had grown up in, with a ring in her hand and a message sent to someone she had never met, and the ledger of that was different. She was alive. Jesse Calloway was home. Amber Wells was home. 43 names in a trafficking ledger had become 43 cases, with 43 families on the other side of their particular terror. 43 was not all of them, would never be all of them, but it was 43 more than nothing, and it was built on a foundation her father had laid and that she had carried forward, and that 61 people in 9 states were now helping to maintain. That was the work of 2 years and the beginning of the work of decades. That was enough to build on. The network was dismantled. The senator was convicted. The man who had buried cases for money was serving his time. The system that had made all of it possible was being rebuilt imperfectly with human hands and human judgment by people who had decided it mattered enough to try. None of it was finished. Things like this are never finished. There is always another network, another garage, another deadline, another person sitting in a basement waiting for someone to open the door. But there was also Clint's watch. There were 61 people in 9 states who had signed on to a structure for doing something about it. There were cases being built and tips being documented and connections being made between the people who saw things and the people who could act on them. There was a garage on Commerce Street in Clarksville, Tennessee, with a 1979 Harley-Davidson Sportster in the front window, tuned and ready, belonging to a 23-year-old woman who had finished her father's work and was doing her own. The tools were on the wall in their places. The stool was at the bench with her initials carved underneath where no one could see them. The ring was on her hand. The road was there whenever she needed it, the same road that had always been there waiting for someone to ride it forward. The ring on her finger, the flannel on the hook, the road ahead. She had asked for help. Help had come. She had found the right people and trusted them and built something that would last past her, past any single person, past the particular circumstances that had started it. She was building something so that when the next person asked, help would come for them too. That was the work. That was the whole of it. That was enough.